My name is Jakob Hallgren, and I am the Swedish ambassador to the Republic of Korea. First of all, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on the role of cities in combating corruption and strengthening human rights. This event, which is going to be really exciting, I can promise you, is co-hosted by the Swedish Embassy in Seoul, where I work, and the Raoul Wallenburg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law as part of the annual World Human Rights Cities Forum in Gwangju. Now, I am so glad that the World Human Rights Cities Forum is still happening despite the global challenges posed by the pandemic and COVID-19. So even though I would have loved to meet you all and to see you live, this virtual format that we're doing actually also allows us to have participation from all over the world, which actually opens up better possibilities for interaction. Now, I would say that typically the strongest democracies have the lowest level of corruption. And corruption declines when democratic institutions work together with the people to hold officials accountable. So today and in this session, we are going to explore and clarify these links between anti-corruption efforts, transparency, democracy, and human rights. So in this session, we will discuss these linkages, explore different ways to counter corruption, and highlight local government's role in promoting democracy and strengthening human rights. We will learn more about how cities work with these issues in no less than Mexico, Pakistan, the Republic of Korea, Sweden, and Turkey. Quite exciting, I must say. Now, a key reason for the Embassy of Sweden to co-host today's event and today's session is the Swedish government's, that I work for, policy initiative called the Drive for Democracy. And so this Drive for Democracy aims to provide support to the institutions, to the processes, and to the defenders of democracy, while also responding to the growing threats and challenges facing democracy today. And this drive for democracy stems from a conviction that we all have a duty to raise awareness of that democracy is actually in decline in the world today. It's receding, and also to mobilize support for the fundamental principles of democracy. So as a part of this drive, Sweden co-organizes so-called democracy talks with partners all over the world, and this is one of them, and I'm so glad that we can do this together. Now, we have a full program ahead of us with the discussions divided in 3 short sessions. We have many panelists. So the first session aims to give us an introduction to the connection between corruption and human rights and an overview of the global trend. In the second session, we will hear mayors and city representatives sharing their experiences from working on transparency and against corruption. In the third session, we will hear examples from 2 countries on their work trying to standardize and to create systems for local level accountability and human rights protections. And after each session, we will have time for discussion and some questions from also you in the audience. I hope you're preparing your questions. You can start doing that right now. Now, I am very excited about today's discussion, which I believe will make us both wiser and give us hope and inspiration on how to strengthen and how to expand democracy, human rights, and democratic values. But before we start, I would like to inform you out there, our esteemed audience, that it is, as I said, also possible to ask questions via a function called Slido. These questions, as I said, can already be posted right now, and I will then select some questions that will be asked to our panelists. And to access Slido, please just click the link that is shared in the chat room on Zoom. On Slido, you need to enter the event code called WHRCF, WHRCF, and then click on the International Human Rights Policy session. I would really like to encourage you in the audience to engage with us. We like that. So please start to think about your own questions and share them, as I said, with Slido. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first esteemed and interesting speaker today. We are so honored to have Mr. Morten Kjaerum with us. Mr. Morten Kjaerum is the director of the Raoul Wallenburg Institute, who is also a co-organizer, actually, of the entire forum. So, Mr. Kjaerum, you are going to give us an introduction to the links between human rights promotion and the fight against corruption. And I must say, I really look forward to this important first scene setter. Morten Kjaerum, Mr. Kjaerum, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jakob, for the introduction. And I share with you the excitement about the discussions that we have today. When we, those of you who followed the discussions yesterday, the opening panels, etc., I think the word corruption came up quite a few times. So I think that more and more people see this as an integral part of what we are discussing here. So it has been a pleasure organizing this with the embassy. Thanks to you, Jakob, and your team. And today, of course, it is widely recognized that there is a clear relationship between corruption and the enjoyment of human rights, and that that corruption is one of the biggest impediments globally, not only for the realization of human rights, but also for the wider sustainable development agenda, as it's so well established in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Actually, in the goals in SDG target 16.5, states have committed themselves to substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all its forms. It's a very powerful statement, and we should definitely use that one. In his drive to build back better after the COVID-19 crisis, the UN Secretary General in August underscored that, and I quote, "Inequality is associated with economic instability, corruption, financial crisis, increased crime, and poor physical and mental health," end of quote. That is why he has called now for a new social contract at the national level, a social contract where for sure cities will play a crucial role. Without the cities, no contract. The fight against corruption is a key component of the reconstruction. Or you could also turn it the other way around. If corruption is not seriously addressed, societies will simply not build back better. There's no way if we continue the old way. Because corruption erodes the rule of law, erodes justice systems, affects delivery of public services, interferes with political processes, and of course you can just continue the list. In this way, corruption is obviously, as I said before, an impediment for the realization of human rights, such as the right to health, education, fair trial, freedom of expression, and other core rights. But corruption and corrupt activities can also violate human rights directly or indirectly. So just consider for a moment how nature most often is blamed for the collapse of buildings and killed persons in connection with earthquakes, floodings, tsunamis, etc. So that is the fault of the nature. That's why we call it a natural disaster. nature is to be held accountable. That's sort of the way we see it today. However, most often it only becomes a disaster due to human failures, neglect, and very often corruption. We know the situation where funding has been provided to enforce the buildings on the fault lines. Everybody knew that these buildings, villages were built on a fault line, and therefore they had received funding to enforce it. Or mechanisms to provide tsunami protection to avoid casualties, etc. However, when the funding disappears in the pocket of corrupt or fraudulent officials and politicians or others, the disaster materializes with the earthquake or tsunami, and the accountability is hidden behind the veil of natural disaster. But what we have is that the right to life, right to health, and many other rights have been grossly violated by human neglect. So let's drop the word natural disaster, talk about disasters, and nature does what nature do. According to the UN, the global cost of corruption is at least $2.6 trillion every year. I mean, it's astronomous. This amount would be enough to actually realize, I think, most of the SDGs. So there's a lot to be gained. Of course, corruption exists everywhere. No country is immune. Sweden, Denmark, many other European countries, if not all, we see every now and then corruption scandals and cases. However, as the ambassador said, corruption seems to breed best in society where civil and political rights are restricted, with no or limited access to information and weak functioning mechanisms holding officials accountable to the public, limited freedom of media, etc. So in this sense, human rights implementation is a key instrument to reduce corruption. There's also another dimension of this, namely the stigmatization. Today, corrupt practices are in many places perceived as part of normality. I would almost claim that globally, it's still not sufficiently stigmatizing to be corrupt. There may be many reasons for this, but one of them could be that corruption is often perceived as the crime without victims, which of course is nonsense. Human rights make the victims visible. Human rights can illuminate the person who could not get a fair trial since the judge was bribed, or the kids that could not get access to education, or the sick person who couldn't get access to the health services because the money that should create the health services, the school, had disappeared, had evaporated. So in this way, it threatens the entire system. Corruption, and this should be my last words, corruption breeds disillusion with governments and governance, and is often the root of political dysfunction and social disunity. Human rights are all about protecting the individual human being as a rights holder and creating a coherent community. This is a stronger awareness about the human rights violations that corruption leads to, I believe, can mobilize a bottom-up reaction against such practices, against corrupt practices. And this is, of course, where local authorities will play a key role in years to come in turning societies away from corruption and building trust in governance and governance structures. So thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Mr. Kjaerum, Morten, for that great introduction. I like that we're really putting on the table this neglected link between human rights and corruption, and this argument that many human rights problems clearly are caused by corruption, and that we need to implement and to fund the human rights mechanisms are really well taken. I also like your point about that more stigma is needed about the human rights and corruption perpetrators, really. Now, I was going to ask a question, but I will not do that because you spoke a little bit too long. So I will actually move on to the next speaker, and you, Morten, you will have a chance to comment and conclude at the very end. So I look forward to that in order to keep to our schedule. So Ms. Kim So-ah, you are the director of the Human Rights Policy Division at the Ministry of Justice of the Republic of Korea, where I am. I think you will share your reflections and knowledge about the global trends and patterns of how corruption affects the protection and the enjoyment of human rights. And I think that this sounds extremely exciting and interesting as a second scene setter for today's event. So Ms. Kim So-ah, please, the floor is yours.
네, 야콥 할그렌 대사님 소개 감사합니다. 시간 관계상 바로 발제를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 부패 철폐 운동은 오랫동안 부패라는 범죄 예방과 처벌 그리고 기소를 위한 국제 협력 등 형사법적 관점에서 다소 협소하게 다루어졌습니다. 2000년대 들어와서 국제적으로 부패와 인권의 상관관계가 본격적으로 논의되었는데요. 모톤 소장님께서 말씀하신 것처럼 2015년 유엔 총회에서 채택된 지속 가능한 발전을 위한 유엔 2030 아젠다가 대표적입니다. 이 지속 가능한 발전 목표는 빈곤, 질병, 교육 등 인권의 어떤 일개 보편적인 문제를 해결하기 위해서 17개 목표를 두고 있는데요. 특히 평화롭고 포용적인 사회와 책무성 있는 제도 구축을 목표로 하는 16번이 다른 목표들을 실현하기 위한 핵심 요소로 매우 중요합니다. 그런데 바로 부패 철폐가 이 16번 목표의 세부 과제로 포함이 되어 있어요. 불법 재정 유출과 뇌물 수수 줄이기, 그 외에도 책임 있고 투명한 조직과 포용적 참여적 의사결정 촉진이 있습니다. 이렇게 인권 보호를 위해서 부패 철폐가 중요하다는 인식과 함께 인권에 기반한 접근이 분명해졌습니다. 공중의료나 교육, 사회복지 서비스를 제공하는 이렇게 시민들과 밀접하게 일하는 지방정부 또한 최근 부패를 인권 문제로 인식하고 그 해결을 위한 논의를 활발하게 해오고 있습니다. 그렇다면 뇌물수수와 횡령 그리고 직권남용 등 전형적인 부패 관점에서 벗어나서 부패가 인권 보호에 미치는 영향은 무엇일지 말해보겠습니다. 먼저 부패는 인권의 중요한 사회적 보호 기제인 법치와 적법 절차를 파기한다는 것입니다. 가장 큰 피해자는 힘없는 빈곤층과 사회적 약자이고 그 파급력 또한 집단적이어서 매우 큽니다. 부패가 인권보호에 미치는 부정적 영향에 대한 가장 대표적인 사례는 사법부의 부패를 들 수 있습니다. 법관과 변호사의 독립에 관한 유엔 특별보고관은 2017년 유엔 총회에 제출한 보고서에서 사법부의 부패가 면책과 불처벌을 주장한다고 강조를 했습니다. 불처벌의 문제는 인권보호를 위해서 반드시 해결해야 할 오랜 수건이기도 합니다. 사법적 접근권과 공정한 재판을 받을 권리를 침해받은 피해자가 적절한 구제를 받을 수 없게 되기 때문입니다. 그리고 이러한 불처벌의 문화가 확산이 되면 사회적 약자에 대한 차별이 심화되고 공정이 훼손되는 결과 그리고 그런 문화가 발생하게 됩니다. 그런데 부패에 대한 인권적 접근 방식은 부패의 문제를 시스템의 문제에서 개인의 권리침해 문제로 인식하게 만든다는 데 중요한 포인트가 있습니다. 그래서 정부와 공공기관의 투명성과 책임성을 강조하고 사람들의 참여와 평등을 요구하는 인권적 접근은 피해자를 포함한 사람들을 부패 철폐 운동의 중심 주체로 끌어들이게 됩니다. 또한 부패가 인권에 미치는 악영향을 개별적인 인권 침해 사건들을 통해서 여러 방면에서 구체적으로 보여줌으로써 더 쉽게 부패 문제를 사회적 문제로 부각시킬 수 있게 됩니다. 그 결과 부패 척결을 위한 새로운 연대가 가능하게 되는 것이죠. 한 가지 예를 들어보겠습니다. 2005년 한국 철강 회사인 포스코가 인도 정부와 MOU를 맺고 오디사주에 120억 달러가 투입되는 대규모 제철소 건설 프로젝트를 추진을 했습니다. 하지만 주민들은 부실한 보상과 강제 이주에 반발해서 대규모 반대 시위를 벌였고요. 인도 경찰이 시위대를 폭력 진압하는 과정에서 이것이 국제적 문제로 떠올라서 2017년 결국 취소되었습니다. 주민들의 주거권과 환경권 등이 포함된 생존권이 달린 인권 문제였습니다. 그런데 이 사안의 또 다른 문제는 인도 행정당국이 법을 위반해서 주민들의 동의를 얻는 절차를 생략하고 제한적인 환경 영향 평가를 통해서 포스코에 환경 허가를 내준 것이었습니다. 인도 환경법원은 2011년 인도 행정당국이 포스코에 내준 환경 허가를 재검토하라고 결정을 했습니다. 즉 적법 절차 위반으로 인해서 정부의 투명성과 책임성이 훼손된 것이지요. 이것은 직권남용 등이 결부된 부패의 문제로 볼 여지가 있습니다. 대규모 인권 침해 시작점이 부패였고, 그리고 그 종착점도 부패에 대한 척결이어야 됩니다. 왜냐하면 이러한 관련 법규에 근거한 제도나 절차가 제대로 작정하지 않고 부패가 만연한다면 또다시 인권 침해가 발생할 수 있게 되기 때문입니다. 결국 부패 철폐와 인권 침해 구제의 지향점은 투명하고 책임성 있는 법 집행기관이라는 시스템의 문제로 연결이 됩니다. 마지막으로 부패 문제를 인권적으로 접근하면 국내 구제 절차 외에도 국제인권보호 메커니즘을 활용을 모색할 수 있다는 말씀을 덧붙입니다. 감사합니다.
Right. Well, thank you so very much, Ms. Kim Soa, for this very pertinent point. I really like this link between corruption and the judiciary and the direct effect on human rights and the examples that you brought up. I think that was interesting. And since you are both a government official and an expert on corruption and on human rights, I really think this is very important and relevant for today's discussion. And maybe I would also like to bring in Morten here, and we should have a discussion for a while, and then we will see if there are some questions from the audience as well. But if I start with you, Ms. Kim Soa, so do you agree that there is a disconnect between the discourse and the work for human rights and against corruption? Do you think that this is a neglected and an unexplored area? And I mean, do you see the benefits, and how can we connect the dots between the two in a better way? If I start with that question to you, if I may.
It's hard to say they are totally disconnected. Many anti-corruption actors already integrate human rights to some extent. They both aim for the promotion of accountable, transparent institutions in all levels. I would rather say that they have a different entry point. Anti-corruption movements have a tendency to regard corruption as a systemic matter and seek institutional reform, while human rights movement takes it up as the violation of people's rights and seeks remedies for victims, which result in institutional reform. So the same goal. So I cannot hear you.
Yeah, no, sorry, I had to unmute myself there. So you are arguing that we're talking about two different communities that somehow need to meet. I mean, it's not that terrible, but there could. It seems as if we have two communities that could maybe better talk to each other. Is that a correct understanding of what you say?
Yes, that's correct. And already I mentioned in my presentation, because there are, for example, there are 2 points of the benefits linking each other. First, that the human rights-based approach on anti-corruption puts various stakeholders, especially victims, at the center and makes corruption a public issue more easily. And it contributes to extend alliance and solidarity to fight against corruption in domestic and international level. Second, this linkage can promote access to human rights mechanisms to combat corruption. Wide range of mechanisms exist for monitoring compliance with human rights at the national, regional, and international level. So new opportunities for litigation or monitoring can be identified, I think.
That's a very, very interesting points. I'd like to dig a little bit into this. I mean, I think, Morten, you were talking about all of those human rights mechanisms and how they are sometimes neglected and not sufficiently strengthened, maybe, or even funded, and so on. And you, I mean, at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, you work with these issues every day, both research and education. And you work, I guess, both with the implementation and the underpinning institutions and so on. And I mean, as you see it, where do we have the biggest challenges in this respect? Is it the funding? Is it the do we have enough knowledge? Is it the political will? Or where do you see the challenges, and what do we need to kind of focus on as we take this forward?
Thank you. No, first of all, I think it's a question of understanding, as Kim Chua so brilliantly put it. I mean, say that the anti-corruption environment has focused on the perpetrator. That is sort of, you could almost say, a criminal law approach, and the human rights is a victim oriented, and that's where we can really capitalize by bringing these two worlds together. It's not that the one should take over or be prevailing, but it's in the complementarity between the two where there's a lot to be gained. And I would say that one of the low-hanging fruits here in the in moving it forward is that we in the human rights world take more on board the anti-corruption training in our courses, in our outreach to the institutions and so forth. It has been absent from the human rights agenda, as well as the other way around. When we look at a map of where we see anti-corruption training and human rights training globally, there's so much more human rights training going on than anti-corruption training. So I think we can move the issue quite a bit by simply getting the human rights world to take integrated more into our thinking. And then, as you say, then there are, of course, a number of barriers. There's a lot of areas to be addressed. I mean, it's in the officials, getting the courts to understand their role. But what we experience from our training is that when you then sort of start focusing on some of the very tangible steps that you can take. I mean, for example, in a court, you make a better system of registration of cases. That's a crucial point in order to avoid corruption, because if you don't have a proper registration system, then cases, whoop, it suddenly disappears. And of course, the whole accountability system of the economic accountability in ministries and municipalities is another element. So just a simple thing as a 4I principle, that is not only one person signing, but actually 2 persons or maybe even 3 persons, etc. So all these small tangible steps that you can take, and that's what we're trying to build in. And that's overall, coming back to your drive for democracy, what, so say, the democratic structures is about, is to create that transparency, which is so much needed in many societies.
That's very interesting. I mean, I really like when you're saying, both of you, that there is like 2 communities. One is focusing on the perpetrators and one on the victims, and it seems as if that's extremely complementary. But you also kind of alluded to that these 2 communities are maybe not collaborating as much as they should. I mean, do you at Raoul Wallenberg, do you do a joint research with Transparency International or whatnot? And I mean, is this like a developing area of research and implementation as you see it, or is it just that it's all linked into how we push for the democratic institutions and how we safeguard and continuously develop them? How do you see that, Mr. Kjaerum?
It's interesting. Of course, I can tell you, back in the mid-zeros, 2004, 5, 6, a number of us in different spots in Geneva, in Sweden and other places, tried to raise the discussion. I mean, it was not coordinated, it just sort of came up. I tell you, it fell totally flat. There was absolutely no interest, nothing happened. And then in 2015, 16, 17, some of us tried again in different corners, and it was like a bushfire. So something has happened in our societies So there's a much more reception of it today. So we convened in 16 a roundtable with the key UN bodies, Transparency International. Cecilia was there as well from the municipalities, from business sector, some of the big companies, Ericsson, Maersk, and others. And people lined up. We thought we should have a small roundtable of 10, 15 people. Suddenly we were like 45, 50 people in the room. We flew in from, I would almost say, everywhere. And so there is a momentum. And yes, we do have a very close collaboration with Transparency International, and the actors have found each other. But for that very meeting that we hosted in Lund, I mean, some of the, for example, anti-corruption academies, I mean, they were very reluctant when we first sent the invitation. But then, okay, we will be there. And then we had a very vibrant meeting where a lot of recommendations came out. And I know the UN took it back and other. So now it's very fortunate that the Office of the High Commissioner has put it on their agenda as sort of one of the frontline issues to be explored. So, so I think that there is a very good momentum at the moment, and as your question, the partners or the different actors are definitely working much closer together than before.
Well, that's good to hear, and I hope that today's discussion will continue to boost and fuel and expand the knowledge about it. Miss Kim So-ae, I mean, you are from Korea, and I mean, you have this luxury of both being an expert, of course, in your own right, and then also representing your own government. I mean, how do you see this from the Korean vantage point, what Morten just said about this emerging momentum for the link between the issues and the communities, maybe from a Korean point of view or referring to other countries?
As I work at the Ministry of Justice, of course, that I'd like to mention that the functioning law enforcement system, establishment of a functioning law enforcement system is crucial. And maybe I can give you one example: the anti-torture campaign in Sri Lanka, which one regional human rights organization launched in around 2000, where I worked. I worked there for 6 years. There was a widespread practice of torture in police stations in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lankan government rectified Convention Against Torture and introduced a domestic legislation in 1994, which defines torture as a crime with minimum sentence of 7 years. However, the perpetrators seldom prosecuted due to the large scale of corruption in the law enforcement agencies. So my organization launched the anti-torture campaign in 3 layers. In national level, we documented hundreds of torture cases for a few years and reported to the relevant government agencies as well as the UN special rapporteurs on torture to seek justice and redress for the victims. Through the individual cases, we highlighted the several corruptive points in the system. First, there was no independent avenue for the victims to register complaints. The victims had to go back to the same police station where they tortured. So no investigation, no action of the investigation. And second point was that the ineffective witness protection system. And also the problem, another problem was that the threat to the human rights defenders. So the organization selected some good torture cases and supported victims filing a suit in civil and criminal court, and seek prosecution of perpetrators and compensation for the victims. In international level, we reported all the individual cases to the relevant special rapporteurs, mainly the special rapporteurs on torture, on the situation of the human rights defenders, on the independence of judiciary and lawyers, and finally that the Committee Against Torture, even the committee gave a very strong recommendations to the Sri Lankan government. In community level, we organized the torture victims together with local groups and provided the necessary assistance. Subsequently, they and their family members became active ally in the anti-torture campaign, and National Anti-Torture Network has formed later. Finally, a few years later, the National Police Commission of Sri Lanka, which has authority on disciplinary measures on police officers, set up 24 hotline for reporting torture cases. And the Attorney General's Office of Sri Lanka established a special unit for solely investigating torture cases. So this campaign, I think, can show how a human rights-based approach can reveal actual problems of corruption in justice system and use human rights mechanisms in national and international level for institutional reforms. I think maybe can be a good example.
That I must say was a very pertinent and interesting example that you brought up there. So I'm really so glad that we are kind of putting these issues on the table. Now, I think we should bring in the audience, don't you agree? So I actually received already several questions. Morten and Kim Soa, if you could just listen, I will pick two of them and then you can decide who of you would like to respond to them. So I have one, the first, which is, are human rights of the poorer people more severely violated compared to those of the wealthier? Does it depend on the country and the context? So that is one question. I let you think a little bit about that one. And then the second question is, there is a growing concern that we might get used to undermine basic rights amid the pandemic. How can we compromise between the pandemic and human rights? Well, those were two kind of not easy ones, but you can decide who would like to take either one of them or both.
I will choose the first question.
Please, Kim Soa, start.
Yes, I will choose the first question. That's why that the human rights approach is very important to combat the corruption, because the anti-corruption campaign thinks that the people think that the corruption scandal is a huge, big systemic matter, and they don't know how to deal with it. Like they don't have a clear idea how to tackle the point. But the human rights approach can actually bring this systemic matter to the violation of the rights of the people, so that people takes it up as their matters. That is the very important point. So that's why that the human rights approach are more concerned about the socially marginalized people's rights, and they take up the cases of the cases of those marginalized groups, rather than like the big politicians or something like that. I want to call it like a micro approach, so that documenting and reporting these socially marginalized people's cases, and which part actually is an obstacle to seek the justice for those people. I think that is the main point, and actually that leads to that institutional reform in various stages.
Thank you so much, Kim Soa. Morten, Kjaerum, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you. I think the COVID crisis has been a gigantic mirror to our society on some of the weaknesses and the areas which are dysfunctional, and particularly the inequality in most societies. And so when in the Build Back Better process, I think definitely what the first question was about, sort of the getting the poor, the marginalized on board, will be an important part. But we see now an increased focus and respect for economic, social, and cultural rights. I think this may be the moment in history where what was already said in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, that these are interrelated and interconnected, maybe finally can be realized, and we can start moving forward on that. So I think there will be a movement here. But how do we balance this? And that was the second question. I mean, the sort of say the fight against the pandemic, or you could say that protect the right to life, the right to health, and so on. And then on the other side, also the freedom of movement, the freedom of assembly, etc., where sort of say now there are limits to how many we can meet. We in many countries you cannot move around freely, etc. And that is, I mean, it is sort of the what governments, decision makers have to balance, and where we need that transparent system to see what and be brought into the machine room actually when they make the decisions on what is necessary and is the next step proportional. I think there's a very good example from Sweden, where the discussion on tracing apps is that, yes, that is probably a tool that can be used to fight the pandemic, and it is being used in many countries. Even some countries have allowed the police to hack people's phones to enter into it. Country like Sweden said, no, that is not strictly necessary, and we think it's disproportional in terms of the privacy of people. So we will not take that step. At least initially, that was the outset. So these are some of those assessments that countries and decision makers will have to do, and where you need that democratic transparency to actually say, okay, in this case, some countries, we said we will have such an app. In other countries, they said no, and so to say, and that is within the democratic decision making or room to make that decision. I think hacking other phones is then, I would consider, a violation. So it's extremely difficult. And of course, when we then come to the issue of confinement in countries where there are no social allowances, so it's a question whether you sort of say may run the risk of getting the disease, the COVID-19 virus, or you basically starve at home. It's unsolvable at the moment, but hopefully in building back better, we can start addressing more seriously. At least I think the global community and the local community cannot escape taking the discussions both now during the COVID and certainly when we're on the other side of it.
Well, thank you so much, Morten, for those reflections. I mean, as a moderator, I must take the liberty to also provoke a little bit. I mean, it's of course easy to say that we should build back better, but then how do you actually do it? And it leads to a final question. And now we only have very little time, so I would like brief comments from you here. But I mean, how do we promote the international mechanisms in defending human rights that you just pointed out? Because that is the part of the building back better, to make sure that those mechanisms are, well funded, respected, effective, and all of that. But you only have like 20 seconds to comment on these both now, because we need to move on. And Morten, you will come back, and I will say bye to Kim Soa. But would you like to start, Morten, or but briefly?
30 seconds. I'd say that it's, for the moment, the human rights mechanisms get 3% of the UN budget. And in the UN, we have peace, development, and human rights, 3 on an equal footing. When it comes to funding, human rights is 3%. Raise it to 4%, 5% at least, so we can move on this. It is serious, and the mechanisms are starving.
That's a good point. 30 seconds. Ms. Kim Soa, you get the last word before we have to wrap up. Brief.
The international human rights mechanism is already there. So the point is that how to use it. So good documentation is important. I'd like to say good documentation is important. Anti-corruption, the actors, they are good at analysis. Human rights, the movement actors, they are good at documenting rights of cases. How to combine effectively and then make show that the whole picture of the human rights problem as well as the corruption in the system. I think that is the issue. So mechanism is there. So we should learn the effective way of documentation, I think. Very good.
So funding and better implementation. Thank you for that extremely interesting first scene-setting session. Kim Soa, I know you need to leave, so thank you so very much for your contributions. Morten Kjaerum, please hang on. You will be with us at the very end. But this actually concludes the first part of our session today. You will now see a video, and then we will be back in a minute. Thank you so far, but please hang on and stay tuned. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the second part of this webinar on the roles of cities in combating corruption and strengthening human rights. My name is Jakob Hallgren. I am the Swedish ambassador to the Republic of Korea, and I'm really proud to moderate this already very interesting event, which is co-hosted between my institution, the Embassy of Sweden in Seoul, and the Raoul Wallenburg Institute for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. And this is, of course, part of the World Human Rights Cities Forum in Gwangju. Now, I must say, I think we have just listened to a very exciting and interesting first scene-setting discussion on the links between human rights, democracy, and anti-corruption. Now, in this second part today, we will move to more practical issues, where we will actually focus on the implementation at the city level. And for this, we have three speakers, and I'm really so pleased to introduce our first speaker in this session, who is no less than Mayor Cheol-mo. Mr. Cheol-mo is the mayor of the city of Hwaseong here in the Republic of Korea, and Hwaseong was actually one of 4 cities to receive a first grade in the integrity assessment by the Korean Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission, the ACRC, last year in 2019. So Mayor Cheol-mo, I think that you have quite a lot to share with you. The floor is yours. Please start.
네, 반갑습니다. 화성시장 서철모입니다. 무엇보다도 인권과 반부패 관련하여 이런 자리를 마련해 주신 야콥 할그렌 대사님을 포함해서 많은 분들께 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 한국 정부는 반부패, 청년 문제에 대한 근본적인 해법 마련을 위해 이걸 국정과제로 설정하고 관련법을 강화하고 반부패 기구를 신설하는 등 제도적 개선을 시작하고 있습니다. 그 결과 2016년도에 세계 53위였던 한국의 부패 인식 지수는 현재 39위로 조금씩 나아지고 있습니다. 중앙정부와 지방정부가 반부패, 청년 문제에 대한 지향점을 공유하고 그 역할을 분담하면서 나타난 소중한 성과입니다. 거시적이고 포괄적인 중앙정부 역할과는 다르게 지방정부는 시민의 생활 영역에서 보다 현실적이고 실천적인 방식으로 문제를 풀어나가는 게 중요합니다. 저는 시장으로 선출된 이후 행정에 대한 신뢰를 회복하는 문제가 무엇보다도 중요하다고 생각했습니다. 아무리 좋은 정책과 사업을 계획하더라도 이를 집행하는 행정을 신뢰하지 못한다면 아무런 소용이 없습니다. 이전까지 행정이 초래한 불신이 부정과 부패에서 비롯되었다고 진단하고 강한 의지를 가지고 청렴도시 구현을 시정과제로 공표했습니다. 다음으로 공정, 인권, 신뢰와 같은 가치를 명확한 목표로 설정했습니다. 반부패와 청렴을 실현하는 과정이 궁극적으로 시민의 권리를 보장하는 인권이고 동등한 기회를 보장하는 공정이며 행정에 대한 신뢰이기 때문입니다. 우선 공직자들의 자발적인 실천을 이끌어내기 위해 정례화된 간부회의를 열어 저의 확고한 의지를 강조하고 실천을 당부했습니다. 이를 구체화시키기 위해 청렴 실천 평가 지표를 개발하고 그 결과를 인사, 성과급 등 인센티브로 반영하였으며 공직자의 도덕적인 문제에는 엄격하게 조치함으로써 청렴 실천을 위한 동기와 책임을 분명히 해왔습니다. 마지막으로 중요한 것은 소통입니다. 시민으로부터 위임받은 권리를 시민들에게 돌려줘야 한다는 것이 저희 시정 철학입니다. 그런데 현실적으로 시장에게 권한과 정보가 집중되어 시민 스스로 그들의 권리를 주장하기 어렵고 시정에 관한 정보를 얻기가 쉽지 않았습니다. 시민의 권리를 되돌려주기 위해서는 무엇보다도 소통이 중요했습니다. 그래서 소통 행정을 역점적으로 추진하였으며 시민과 공유하는 정보가 확대될수록 시민의 참여가 증가하고 다양한 의견이 개진되었습니다. 시장 취임 이후 페이스북 생중계를 통해 진행한 시민과의 소통이 218번을 넘어섰고 시민들이 1135건의 안건을 제안하였으며 이를 시정에 반영하기 위하여 시민과 함께 행정을 이끌어 나갔습니다. 시민과 시정 철학을 공유하고 시민의 참여를 보장하는 소통과 협력을 확대하자 참여와 자치의 가치가 확산되었고 신뢰 문화가 조금씩 뿌리내리기 시작했다는 믿음이 생겼습니다. 이와 같은 변화와 믿음은 놀라운 성과를 나타냈습니다. 2019년도 공직사회 청렴도 평가에서 609개 공공기관 중에서 1등급, 전국 3위라는 쾌거를 거두었으며 2017년도 평가에서는 4등급이었던 것과 비교하면 변화를 상상할 수 없었던 결과입니다. 또한 2020년도 경기도 청렴 대상에서도 우수기관으로 선정되었습니다. 그리고 소통 분야에서는 2019년 대한민국 공공정책 대상 지방행정부문 대상, 전국 지자체 수기 기반 주민참여 사례, 행정안전부 장관상 수상, 2019년 전국 기초단체 매니페스토 우수사례 경진대회 최우수상을 수상하기도 했습니다. 이와 같은 성과에 힘입어 공직사회에 대한 신뢰가 회복되면서 상식과 원칙이 살아있는 공식 문화가 강화되기 시작하였으며 시민의 권리 보장을 최고의 가치로 삼는 시정 철학이 시민 참여와 소통으로 구현되는 기분 좋은 변화가 나타나고 있습니다. 우리는 이제 청렴도시의 첫걸음을 내딛은 것에 불과하지만 이에 머물지 않고 공정, 인권, 신뢰의 가치가 구현되는 청렴도시로 전진할 것입니다. 화성시의 변화가 인권의 지역화, 인권도시의 미래를 앞당기는 데 일조하기를 바라며 언제나 세계적인 도시들과 함께하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Well, Mayor Cheol-mo, thank you so very much for these very interesting and I think pertinent words. I really like your focus on the citizens. I mean, communicating with the citizens, engagement, and I somehow feel that this there is a political will to address these issues, which I must say, you know, as a layman, thinks is really key to be successful in these efforts. And maybe, I mean, if you may, would you care to give maybe one or two examples of this anti-corruption and transparency issues and how that may be linked to human rights? If you can give just some reflections or maybe an example about that.
네, 한 가지 간단한 사례를 소개하겠습니다. 화성시는 그 예산 규모가 3조 6천억에 다다릅니다. 그리고 많은 사업을 시행합니다. 많은 사업을 시행하면서 그동안 투명성을 강조하다 보니까 이 투명성 강조가 말로만 앞서고 실제로는 더 투명하지 않은 결과를 초래한 게 있습니다. 예를 들면 물건을 구매함에 있어서도 공무원들이 사람들을 만나면 문제가 생긴다고 생각하여 물건을 보지 않고 온라인상에서 구입하는 상황이 발생합니다. 하지만 이건 외형적인 거고 실제로는 본인들이 아는 회사만 계속 선택하는 이러한 카르텔을 만들게 됩니다. 따라서 시청 1층에 공공개방형 미팅 장소를 만들었습니다. 그래서 본인들이 좋은 제품을 만들면 시에다가 미팅을 요청하고 거기서 그 제품을 직접 보고 판단하는 거에 가산점을 주는 제도를 만들었습니다. 그로 인해서 공무원과 업자들이 만나는 걸 공개적으로 할 수 있게 되고 그 공개하는 걸 통해서 점점 좋은 물건이 들어오게 됐고 그 좋은 물건을 구매함으로써 새로운 물건 생산자들은 본인들이 만든 제품을 보다 많이 홍보할 수 있는 기회가 생긴 겁니다. 이로써 그동안은 일부가 독점해서 납품하던 것을 다양한 업체한테 기회가 제공하고, 이게 어떻게 보면은 그 기존의 이권에 대한 카르텔 사슬을 끊는 이러한 계기가 되었습니다. 그리고 공무원들은 그거를 통해서 조금 더 시민들로부터 신뢰를 받고, 이러한 게 아주 작지만 큰 변화라고 생각합니다.
Thank you so very much for that example. I must say, you know, being a public and civil servant myself, I must say that I do agree fully that a focus on transparency is so important, because that, I think, also increases the accountability and ultimately maybe even the trust in the whole in the institutions, and this open platform online, must say, very interesting example. So thank you so much, Mayor Cheol-mo. I would like to continue in our program, and we are now going to move to our next speaker. But please, Mayor, so stay with us, because I would like to discuss with you and the other speakers in a moment. Our next speaker is unfortunately not with us today. This is the mayor of Iztapalapa, Ms. Clara Brugada. So Iztapalapa used to be a district of Mexico City in Mexico up until 2 years ago, but it is now an independent municipality with a population of 2 million people. And Ms. Clara Brugada is Iztapalapa's first mayor, and she is now going to share her thoughts with us in a pre-recorded video. I know that she would really have wished to join us, but with the time zones, it was simply not possible. So I will now invite Ms. Brugada, and we will enjoy her pre-recorded video. Please, Ms. Brugada, the floor is yours.
Hola, yo soy Clara Brugada, soy alcaldesa de Iztapalapa. Iztapalapa es el municipio que tiene mayor número de habitantes de todo el país, casi 2 millones de habitantes. Iztapalapa es una región dinámica, núcleo del comercio de la Ciudad de México y de la región central del país. Hogar de grandes centros educativos y una de las principales vías de acceso a la capital de la nación. Iztapalapa está en la periferia y se ha convertido en el centro de la metrópoli que tenemos en el Valle de México. Cuando tomé el gobierno, me encontré a una región en crisis, sufriendo de los índices de inseguridad más altos de la ciudad, dependiente de servicios privados para el abasto de agua, con más del 60% de las luminarias apagadas, con las calles y caminos en franco abandono y con espacios deportivos y recreativos gravemente deteriorados. El gobierno se encontraba dedicado a planificar la extorsión y las prebendas. Luchar contra la corrupción implicó organizar al gobierno retomando 2 ejes principales. El primero, la austeridad republicana, y la honestidad como otro de los ejes importantes consistió en ver que el presupuesto público, que el dinero público es sagrado para este gobierno y que teníamos que invertirla de la mejor manera. Empezamos a reorganizar la alcaldía. Dividimos en 13 grandes zonas nuestra atención a la población. 13 direcciones territoriales que se convirtieron en 13 gobiernos locales que atienden a la población. Los dotamos de infraestructura, de maquinaria para poder atender los servicios. Decidimos que podíamos hacer más, mucho más, con menos recursos, si regresábamos al gobierno de la alcaldía su esencia, la administración pública, el dotar de servicios directamente y no dedicarnos solo a contratar empresas para cumplir con nuestra función. Es un ejemplo con el cual hicimos que el presupuesto público se multiplicara y que pudiéramos dotar de servicios, transformar Iztapalapa, lograr que estos recursos nos alcanzaran para acabar con el gran rezago en el que encontramos nuestra gran demarcación. También decidimos promover con la ciudadanía la vigilancia y la exigencia para garantizar que la actuación de la alcaldía siempre esté supervisada por los ciudadanos. Decidimos impulsar redes ciudadanas desde cada una de las 14,000 manzanas o bloques de calles que tiene Iztapalapa. Y de esta manera la población participa, exige y está al tanto de las obras que hacemos y se convierte en nuestro principal contrapeso. Para enfrentar el problema de inseguridad, lo primero que hicimos fue construir un gabinete de seguridad con todas las instituciones que tienen que ver con el tema. Nos reunimos todas las mañanas y desde allí se definen las estrategias a seguir. De esta manera hemos logrado que también la población participe para evaluar a los policías. Es muy difícil enfrentarnos a disminuir los índices delictivos si tenemos policía corrupta. Así que es la población, son las redes ciudadanas, es la Asamblea Popular lo que nos ayuda a exigir a los policías el mejor papel para disminuir la incidencia delictiva. Y lo hemos logrado. En 2 años llevamos más del 50% de disminución del delito más importante que se comete en la alcaldía. Iztapalapa ha sufrido históricamente de escasez de agua y hay grupos y sectores que se aprovechaban económicamente de esta situación. Logramos la universalización de la dotación de agua a través de carros cisternas que permitan que la población que no tiene acceso a este vital líquido lo puedan obtener de manera gratuita, sin intermediarios y sobre todo sin que ellos tengan que estar aportando económicamente de manera ilegal. Decidimos impulsar gran parte de los recursos de la alcaldía para transformar el espacio público y para ello hemos diseñado la construcción de estos grandes espacios recreativos, culturales y deportivos que les llamamos utopías, en donde el espacio público se transforma para que nuestra población ejerza sus derechos al deporte. En cada una de las utopías tenemos infraestructura deportiva de alta calidad, espacios para el atletismo, alberca olímpica, gimnasios, etcétera. Tenemos también una infraestructura cultural que permite a la población tener acceso al disfrute y goce de la cultura. Tenemos espacio para la gente mayor, para los jóvenes, para las mujeres, en fin. Y esto se ha logrado gracias a que hicimos una correcta aplicación de los recursos, que acabamos con el rezago de Iztapalapa y que nos dio la oportunidad de hacer estas grandes obras sin corrupción. Vamos a dejar a Iztapalapa con más de 470,000 metros cuadrados de infraestructura deportiva y recreativa nueva y gratuita para la población. La historia de corrupción en nuestro país cobró su cuota diaria de vidas. No hay tragedia o desastre en este país, nuestro México, que no tuviera un ingrediente de corrupción. La lista ha sido inagotable, pero en las cenizas de los incendios o en el lodo de las inundaciones o debajo de los escombros de los sismos, siempre está la acción, omisión o negligencia del poder público y su colusión con intereses privados o grupos clientelares. A eso es a lo que nos hemos estado enfrentando los que actualmente estamos gobernando. Apenas ayer, la Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación resolvió por fin declarar constitucional una consulta ciudadana para determinar si se enjuicia o no a los expresidentes de la República. Más allá de los juicios concretos de cada caso, esta consulta representa la oportunidad de esclarecer la verdad y encontrar la justicia y sobre todo terminar con la impunidad. Estamos haciendo historia, estamos construyendo tiempos nuevos que hoy tenemos que estar a la altura de lo que nuestra población demanda.
Right. Well, thank you so very much, Mayor Brugada, for that, I must say, very interesting message. I mean, I think, it rhymes very well with Mayor Saw. The focus on transparency, the focus on efficient public services, and the focus on security and crime. And I also liked Mayor Brugada bringing up the public spaces and even culture. And I'm convinced after having listened to her about the links to corruption or anti-corruption efforts and by extension to human rights. Now, we cannot put any questions to Mr. Brugada, Mayor Brugada, but let's remember her comments as we take them forward into the discussion in a moment. So I would now like to turn to our third and last speaker in this part of today's session. Ms. Figen Karahan, you are a council member of the city of Istanbul, which needs no further presentation in Turkey. You are a metropolis with about 15 million inhabitants. So I leave it to you, Ms. Karahan, to tell us more about the work with the transparency and human rights in Istanbul. So Ms. Karahan, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, I'm with Ms. Karahan today. I am Yasemin Hekimoğlu from the Department of Foreign Relations of IMM, and I will be delivering her speech as her interpreter, if that is all okay with you. Okay, first of all, we would like to convey the greetings of our mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu. He's very sorry that he couldn't be here today. And I know we have limited time. Actually, we would like to talk about the Istanbul as a human rights-centered city, transparent and accountable management, women having a voice in IMM, education being the right of all children, pluralist Istanbul, barrier-free Istanbul, healthy Istanbul, and environmentally friendly Istanbul. But we will focus on the transparent and accountable management and women having a voice in IMM mostly. Our mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu was elected with a difference of 13,729 votes at the local elections on March 31st, 2019. But the elections were repeated due to the pressure of the government. As a result, our mayor set out with the statement, "I will not be unfair to anyone, nor let anyone to be unfair to me." And in the elections on 23rd of June, the difference in votes increased to 800,000 in Istanbul. With this choice made by Istanbulites that proved the violations of rights without hesitation, Istanbul embarked on a new journey with a transparent, non-discriminatory, and inclusive management that respects individual rights and freedoms. The existence of transparency, accountability, and healthy control mechanisms in the management of cities are indispensable conditions for cities based on human rights. With this understanding, IMM adopts a transparent approach in the administration of Istanbul. For the first time, tenders and municipal assembly sessions in Istanbul are open to the observance and control of 16 million Istanbulites on live broadcast. Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu holds informative meetings periodically with the awareness that people have the right to information. And women having a voice in IMM administration, IMM, which puts the equality of 16 million Istanbulites without discrimination at the center of its policy, immediately implemented this understanding in its internal employment policy. The rate of female employment and female managers in IMM and its subsidiaries were increased significantly, ensuring effective participation of women in decision-making processes. The administration of IMM increased the rate of female managers working within the municipality from 9.5% to 25%. The rate of women being recruited increased to 30%. Women started to be employed in buses, metros, metrobuses, and ferries that constitute transportation networks of Istanbul. For the first time, women were employed on 169-year-old city line ferries. On the other hand, the shelter process has been completed for women who are victims of violence and in most need, which was already prepared by Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality but was delayed by the pandemic period. In order to empower women working or able to work in a socio-economic and psychosocial sense before establishing a new life in their own homes, a station called IMM Women's Consultancy House, where they can stay temporarily, was opened. The Women's Support Line, which will provide multilingual service, which is Turkish, Arabic, Kurdish, and English, will be available 24/7 after the approval of the Assembly. In addition, women's labor offices aim to empower women within the scope of training and consultancy services. The Directorate of Gender, which was planned to be established within the municipality, was prevented by the Assembly members representing the central government side in IMM. On the other hand, Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality initiated the preparations for the local equality action plan and started a serious work for organizational planning within the institution. All services carried out within Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality aim to give importance to gender equality, to serve and to create awareness in all units in this field. Now, there are a few words we would like to mention on other topics, education being the right of all children. Actually, it is one of the biggest steps taken by IMM and the favorite mega project of our Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu. It is called Our Nursery Istanbul. And in this framework, our motto is 150 daycare centers for 150 neighborhoods of Istanbul. This is a very important project for our mayor. We cannot stress this enough. And the other one is pluralist Istanbul. Unlike previous administrations, our administrations met all the district mayors of Istanbul to discuss the problems of our city in a pluralist approach. For the 2019 to 2024 strategic plan, which will determine the future of the city, workshops were held with all segments of society. So, in conclusion, taking the basic universal values of human rights as its guide in decision-making processes, IMM is taking firm steps towards the goal of leaving a livable Istanbul to future generations with its people-centered management approach in Istanbul, with its pluralistic, egalitarian, transparent, accountable, and environmentally sensitive policy.
Well, thank you so very much for this very inspiring, I must say, presentation. So I really thank both of you, and you should also send the regards to the mayor. I mean, you actually added some new, very interesting dimensions here by talking about inclusive management, by talking about the gender aspect, and this very conscious effort to recruit more women. You're talking about healthy control mechanisms and the focus on education, and especially starting with young children already in the nurseries. I actually get very curious when you say healthy control mechanisms. I mean, there's so much to, but maybe you could just say a couple of words about what that means in your context. And after that, I would like to bring in Mayor Saw also for a discussion. And we already have some interesting questions here online. But maybe just on this concept or notion of healthy control mechanisms, what can you say about that? While you are thinking about that question, if you want to think a little bit more about it, I think I would also like to introduce some questions here from the audience. Are you ready for a reply? We can't hear you. Sorry, you need to unmute.
Okay, you hear me now?
Please, yes,
okay.
Go ahead.
We would like to give you a concrete example on this subject. When we took office, we learned that the number of vehicles was very high in Istanbul, and the number of vehicles per institution managers and company management varied between 3 and 6. We found that most of these vehicles were allocated to the political institutions outside our municipality, and we immediately intervened. We exhibited all vehicles in an area visible to the citizens and returned them. Thus, we have saved approximately 2,000 vehicles per year in the tenders. We have transformed these savings we have made into a 40% discount on transportation for students and free transportation to mothers of children under 4 years old. In addition, thousands of properties belonging to Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality were taken from the municipality and transferred to different institutions before ministries. One of them is the transfer of one of our very important properties.
Well, that was a very pertinent and interesting example. And it seems as if dealing with these issues is also very much about good, efficient, and sound management and governance, because that in turn actually leads to better respect. I mean, less corruption and ideally, hopefully, more enjoyment of human rights. Now we have some 10 minutes, and I would like to bring in Mayor Saw to a discussion among the three of us, and there is actually a question to you, Mayor Saw, here, where a lady called Ulrika is saying that what you talked about was very inspiring, and the question to you, Mayor Saw, is: how do you make sure that you reach all different groups in society? Have you identified any hard to reach groups, essentially groups that are difficult to reach with your policies and your drive? And while you are thinking about that, I have also a broad question to both of you, a second question. Which is, are you following? Is it too quick?
네, 답변 드릴까요?
Yeah.
네, 답변 드리겠습니다.
Let me just put this second question on the table as well. And that is that there is a growing concern that the pandemic situation actually undermines basic human rights. And is there a concern that COVID-19 and the measures actually accelerate corruption? And how can we then compromise quarantine efforts while upholding human rights? So that is a second question to both of you. But Mayor So, are you ready to respond to the first question to yourself?
네, 그 첫 번째 질문에 대해서 다양한 계층의 참여가 매우 중요하다고 생각했습니다. 그래서 화성시에서는 300가구당 1명씩의 지원을 받았습니다. 그러니까 900세대가 살면 900세대가 사는 아파트 단지에 3명을 추천받았습니다. 그 받는 과정에 18세 이상이면 누구나 신청을 할 수 있게 하고, 그게 3명을 뽑는 데서 10명이 신청을 하면 3명을 제비뽑기 추천 방식으로 뽑았습니다. 그래서 300명 세대당 1명씩을 뽑고 그 사람들이 말하고 싶은 거를 자유롭게 말할 수 있는 우선 과정을 만들었습니다. 그러면은 그 사람들이 말한 거를 전체를 300세대만 하면 너무 많아서 6개 그룹으로 묶었습니다. 그래서 한 개 그룹당 200명에서 300명씩을 모아놓고 그분들이 자유 발언을 하고 그 자유 발언한 것 중에서 투표에 의해서 의제를 선택했습니다. 그 의제를 선택해서 그 의제에 대해서 시장한테 제안을 하면 그 다음 주에 준비를 해서 거기에 답변을 주는 이런 형태를 추진했습니다. 그러면서 시간이 지나면서 좋아진 거는 이제 주민들이 발언할 거를 즉흥적에서 하는 것보다 준비를 각각 해와서 스스로 컴피티션이 이루어지는 겁니다. 나는 우리 도시를 위해서 이러한 게 생겨야 돼. 또한 이러한 절차가 부당하니까 이러한 방식으로 바뀌었으면 해. 이러한 제안을 하기 시작했습니다. 근데 대한민국의 첫 번째 사례였는데요. 너무 놀랄 만한 거는 다들 그럼 누가 시간을 내서 자료를 준비해서 제안을 하겠냐, 이런 시각이었습니다. 그런데 이게 6개월, 1년 지나가 보니까 서로들 본인들이 시간을 내서 내가 나를 위해서 지역사회를 변화시켜야 되는구나 라는 생각을 갖게 됐습니다. 단지 아쉬운 건 이게 막 잘 나가는 과정에서 금년에 코로나가 확산되면서 1차적으로 중단되고 있습니다. 이거를 저희가 8월부터는 일부 온라인으로 하고 있는데, 역시 온라인에는 우리가 이번 지금 이 회의를 통해서도 느끼겠지만 아직까지는 온라인 환경이 완벽하지 않아서 문제점이 다소 진행되고 있습니다. 자유로운 토론도 어렵고. 그래서 이 코로나가 어느 정도 잠잠해지면 저희는 이걸 확대해야 간다. 또한 우리가 지금도 이걸 온라인으로 회의를 하고 있지만 온라인 회의의 한계점은 지역사회에서 문제가 있습니다. 이런 세계적인 문제를 논하는 데는 시간도 절약할 수도 있고 여러 가지로 편리한 점이 있지만, 지역에 대한 문제는 사람들이 만나서 교감하는 내용을 통해서 약간의 논쟁이 있는 과정이 지역사회를 발전시키고 조금 더 투명한 사회로 가는 과정인데, 온라인으로 하다 보니까 너무 내용이 정제돼 가지고 조금은 자유로운 토론이 위축되는 이런 경향이 있습니다. 그래서 조금 더 아까처럼 많은 사람이 모일 수 있는 라운드 테이블을 만드니까 점점 그 문제가 처음엔 어수선하지만 6개월 정도 지나니까 많이 해결이 됐습니다.
Well, thank you for those very insightful reflections, and I think we all agree that, I mean, I mentioned the opportunities and the possibilities with the online format, but there are of course clearly drawbacks as well. But I kind of sense from your interventions, Mayor, saw that you also tried to live this more inclusive approach in governance, and I see the challenges you are facing, but I think it's still very inspiring. So thank you for that. And Ms. Karahan in Istanbul, do you have any reflections regarding either this hard to reach populations or this maybe much more difficult questions about basic human rights and the measures prompted by the epidemiologists and the pandemic scourge and so on. Would you like to comment on that?
I think we can talk about the topic Healthy Istanbul for this question. So considering the right of people to have equal access to healthcare services as the most fundamental human right, IMN has devoted a significant part of its work to health services within a period of 1 year from the moment it took office. Home treatment services have been provided to 122,000 people, including the elderly, bed-dependent, and disabled patients in the disadvantaged groups. 81,000 sessions of psychological counseling have been provided. 580,000 medical examinations have been provided in the medical centers. Homeless citizens were hosted in service buildings during harsh winter conditions. A healthy living center was built for citizens who need to benefit from continuous health services. The scope of health services will be further expanded in the upcoming period.
Well, thank you so very much. We are now actually approaching the end of this second part of today's session. And I would like you to, you are both experienced managers, town and city managers. And if you would single out, one key learning and recommendation from your own experience in Hwaseong and in Istanbul, what would you like to share with us? And I give you 30 seconds each. Who would like to start?
It will be our inclusive approach, where we opened our municipal assembly meetings on live broadcast. It was very important for the participants' nature of Istanbul in the future.
Can you tell us just please, sorry.
So that we could integrate better with all the sections of our society.
Very, very, very interesting, this concept. You are also talking about an inclusive approach. And Mayor Saw, what would be your key learning and recommendation to us from Hwaseong?
네, 다른 분들도 유사한 말씀을 해주셨는데, 부패 없는 도시로 가는 첫 번째는 시민한테 권리를 주고 많은 시민이 참여할 수 있는 문호를 만들어주는 겁니다. 기존에 행정이 부패했던 이유는 시민들을 차단했기 때문입니다. 누군가가 감시자가 있어야 되는데 가장 완벽한 감시자는 시민입니다. 시민들이 시장을 본인들을 위해서 일하라고 뽑았기 때문에 감시자의 역할을 할 수 있게끔 열어줘야 됩니다. 시민들로부터 위임받은 권한을 시민한테 돌려주는 유일한 길은 시민들이 적극 참여할 수 있는 방법을 끊임없이 고민하는 거라고 생각합니다. 저는 조금 더 고민하고 조금 더 많은 노력을 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for this reflection. I think this second session and the discussion has been really, I think, inspiring. I mean, we talk about the empowerment of the citizens, we talk about inclusivity, we talk about transparency, the efficiency of the public services, all as key to counter corruption and to promote human rights. So thank you so very much, Ms. Karahan and Mayor Saw for sharing this. And this actually concludes our second part of today's session. You are now free to leave, and I will now close because we are going to look at this video again before we start the third part of today's session. Thank you so very much. Right, we are now entering the last part of this webinar on the role of cities in combating corruption and strengthening human rights. I think that it has been quite an interesting discussion today, and it's not over yet. And if there are any newcomers to this session, my name is Jakob Hallgren. I'm the Swedish ambassador to the Republic of Korea. And I must say I'm so proud and thrilled to moderate this session, which is co-hosted by the Embassy of Sweden here in Seoul, where I work, and the Raoul Wallenburg Institute as part of the annual World Human Rights Cities Forum in Gwangju. Now, in this last session, which just ended, we have heard from mayors and representatives from 3 cities in Mexico, in the Republic of Korea, and Turkey. But as you are now tuned into the International Human Rights session of the forum, we will offer even more international examples to give an even broader and better picture, I think, and I look forward to this. This time, during this 3rd session, we will explore and we will hear more about initiatives in Pakistan and also in Sweden on efforts to try to standardize and also to create systems for local level accountability and human rights protection. And in this context, I am really so pleased to introduce our next speaker, which is the first of 2 speakers in this 3rd session. It is Miss Cecilia Berglin, and you are a human rights and a corruption expert at the Swedish Association of Local Authorities and Regions. I do look forward to listen to your contribution to this debate. So Cecilia, Ms. Berglin, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. At first, I want to say I'm very honored to take part of this session that focuses both on human rights and anti-corruption. As the municipalities and regions employer and representative organization in Sweden, Solar advocates our members' interests and offers support and service to our members. And all of the municipalities and regions in Sweden are members of Solar. In Sweden, the municipalities and regions play an important role as places and organizations where human rights must be respected, protected, fulfilled, and promoted on a daily basis in areas as disparate as water supply, public transport, maternity care, and elementary and secondary school. As for the situation related to corruption, Sweden is over the years among the 5 least corrupt countries in the world, according to Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. But of course, Sweden has its challenges too. As a small country, the risk of conflicts of interest is always present. And as for the rest of the world, areas as public procurement, infrastructure, and the building industry are of high risk. As for the subject of this session, to explore different avenues to counteract corruption and strengthen democracy using human rights mechanisms, I really welcome that discussion, a discussion which is too seldom held. With both anti-corruption and human rights as my field of expertise, I'm often surprised on how the work is done by different people in different forums and by different authorities. According to the United Nations, a rights-based approach of working should be permitted by the principle of non-discrimination and equality, participation and inclusion, and transparency and accountability. These principles can also be useful and have an impact when working with anti-corruption. And might I add, often used in different ways in the anti-corruption work, but not addressed and recognized as human rights principles. Using a rights-based approach when working with anti-corruption can be a powerful way to improve both institutional integrity and legal certainty. And one explanation factor that is often used for Sweden's low perceived rate of corruption is the principle of public access to official documents. And that means that every citizen can go to, or inhabitant can go to the authorities and ask for any document that is sent to the authority or produced by the authority. And since transparency and accountability is so important in order to fulfill and protect and respect the human rights, that principle of transparency is really at the core of counteracting both anti-corruption and human rights. With the Sustainable Development Goals, especially stated in Goal 16, as Morten and more of you speakers have talked about, where 16.5 explicitly mention corruption and bribery to substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. The human rights perspective and the anti-corruption perspective is joined. This calls for actions to try to integrate and combine efforts to create synergies in order to more effectively strengthen human rights and reduce corruption. I don't know if you're going to come back to the work of the platform, or should we take that now?
I need to be unmuted for you to hear me. So I was actually going to ask you about this platform, because but I can take that question right away, because you have talked about some key principles which very much rhymes with the earlier discussion, but as a representative of Swedish municipalities and region, I think the audience would be interested to hear how you are kind of operationalizing this through this platform, and maybe some key learnings from that. So please go ahead.
Yeah. Due to the decentralized system and strong local self-governance in Sweden, the human rights commitments are to a high degree implemented on the local and regional level. In order to put into concrete terms what human rights could mean in a Swedish local and regional context, Solar has developed a platform for policy and organizational development. To ensure the content of the platform, Solar has collaborated with the Raoul Wallenburg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. Together with them, Solar called Swedish and international researchers, practitioners, elected officials and representatives of civil society to join in creating the content of the platform. And the idea for the platform is to work as a point of departure and a development tool when management in local and regional authorities wish to strengthen their work with human rights. I think that you can find the platform attached in the material for the conference. Otherwise, you can find the platform in English, translated into English, at Salar's website. And I hope that you can find it useful. It is, of course, adjusted to the Swedish system, but I think you can find some of it interesting for you as well.
And just so that we understand, is this kind of a toolkit, or what is this platform?
It's like a toolkit, and it stresses the different roles that a municipality, a region have to be a defender of democracy, to produce welfare, to be an employer organization, and also a societal actor. So it stresses all these roles and what is important to think about in these different roles.
Okay, well, let's come back to that when we come to our discussion, but that's really fascinating to hear, and thank you. You're really reinforcing the messages that is kind of crying out loud from this whole session today. But I would now like to introduce our final speaker, the second speaker in this third session. And this is Mr. Ali Imran. You are from Pakistan, and you are actually the country team leader for Pakistan at the United Cities and Local Governments Asia Pacific, the UCLG. And I think you are going to talk about some pertinent examples from Pakistan, if I'm not mistaken. But I will let you talk, Mr. Imran. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Excellency Jakob, and thank you, Royal Wallenburg Institute and City of Gwangju for providing this opportunity and honor to be a part of this wonderful and distinguished panel. With regards to Pakistan, if you look at the constitutional scheme, Pakistan is a symmetrical federation with federation, with provinces and federally administrative territories. Since 2010, through a constitutional reform bill, the most of the powers are now transferred to the subnational level. And in the Constitution of Pakistan, we have specific chapters on human rights. There are around 20 articles on human rights in the Constitution, and another 12 articles for the principle of policy. Pakistan is signatory to a number of international treaties, and the Ministry of Human Rights in Pakistan is primary responsible institution to submit those treaty body reports. Recently, Pakistan has submitted around 6 treaty body reports, including a universal periodic report. To ensure the transparency for human rights through local reporting, the Ministry of Human Rights in Pakistan has recently establish and institutionalize a mechanism for disaggregated data collection and technical analysis of data to monitor and evaluate the patterns of emerging human rights trends across Pakistan through treaty implementation cells. Pakistan has also established and introduced initiative regarding national human rights institutions. For example, we have National Commission on the Human Rights, National Commission on the Status of Women, National Commission on the Rights of the Child, and all these are established through acts of the Parliament. Pakistan has also launched the historic National Action Plan on Human Rights in 2016. This comprehensive plan consists of 6 thematic areas. Those include policies and legal reforms, access to justice, implementation of key human rights priorities, international human rights treaties, establishing and strengthening national human rights institutions, and implementation and monitoring mechanism for the action plan. There is also a national task force on human rights as well. It's a high-level body which deals with overseeing the implementation of human rights. At the local level, I would like to focus on that the provincial human rights departments are set up, having mandate with the responsibility for all matters relating to promotion, protection, and implementation of human rights. And within these human rights department are treaty implementation cells are constituted within these human rights departments. And recently, the government and human rights department at the local level, recognizing the value of engagement with the cities, the departments are now in process of establishing district human rights committees to penetrate the human rights values at the local level as well. I would like to say that effective governance is critical for fulfilling the human rights. So in this regard, Pakistan has also affirmed its commitment to 2030 agenda for SDGs. Pakistan has designed a comprehensive national SDG framework, which was approved by the National Economic Council in 2018. The framework set baseline and targets for SDG indicators and will feed into the SDG monitoring and evaluation framework. Pakistan, I would like also to touch on anti-corruption and aspects and legal framework on anti-corruption as well. Pakistan has unfortunately been put in the grey list by the Financial Action Task Force. And following the recommendation of Financial Action Task Force 27 compliant actions, Pakistan has already fulfilled most of its obligation. We have two major laws on anti-corruption and accountability. So we have National Accountability Bureau law, NAB law, and we have anti-corruption law. And Pakistan has recently introduced a number of legislation and policy initiatives to counter terror financing as well in compliance to the FATF compliances. While concluding, I would like to say that Pakistan now have strong institutional mechanism for oversight and corresponding legal and policy framework for protection and promotion of human rights in place. However, as per many human rights institutions and watchdogs, especially Human Rights Watch, there are instances of human rights violation, especially with regards to freedom of expression and belief, violence against women and children, violent extremism, and denial of the right of compulsory education. We have around 25 million children out of school at the moment, despite the fact that we have put the right of education in our constitution through Article 25A. I would like to highlight that the role of media and civil society and local governments, especially the Human Rights Watch group, is very critical in highlighting human rights abuses and violation and creating awareness about the human rights. Excellency, what I see that there is a long way to go to see the fulfilled realization of human rights in Pakistan. I would like to leave my reflections here and would look forward to any of the questions from you or the participants. Thank you very much. Over to you, Excellency Jakob.
Yeah, well, Mr. Imran, thank you so very much for sharing those both reflections on the you know, very valuable legal framework, but also the challenges. And I think we are all, you know, humbled by the challenges and ever more inspired and impressed by the efforts that you are part of. But I mean, you mentioned it only in passing there, but I've heard that you have these treaty implementation cells at the local level, which I understand is some quite new initiative where you engage the local stakeholders in international monitoring of human rights. And of course, we need to grasp the good examples and build on them. And could you maybe just say a few words about that? Then we will get into a discussion. But just as a kickoff, if you could say a couple of words about that, Mr. Imran, please.
Yes, Excellency. Pakistani government has formed treaty implementation cells at the subnational level, at the provincial level, and also at the federal level in 2016. And that was in response to the requirements of generalized scheme of preference plus, which we call GSP plus. It's a status awarded by European Union for trade, bilateral trade. So TICs, the treaty implementation cells, are convened by the Provincial Human Rights Department, and they serve as a mechanism to improve the human rights situation in the country through supervision of the implementation of 27 UN conventions to which Pakistan is signatory. These treaty implementation cells do not only provide support in implementation of the strategic plan, but also work as coordination mechanism between federal and provincial levels. It also supportive of the identification of gaps in policies, awareness raising, program, etc. And the treaty implementation cell also provide an opportunity at subnational level to monitor the human rights violation situation and listen to the concerns of the vulnerable groups. Excellency, I would also like to highlight that the role of cities, the local settlements, may it be village, may it be a town, may it be a cities, are very important because these are the places where everything is happening, and cities should be at the core of the human rights implementation and required to be involved by the provincial and national governments in planning and execution of human rights treaties and laws. Pakistan has prepared its voluntary national review report to United Nations in 2019, but it was unfortunate that the voices of the local governments were not included systematically into that VNR as well. So what we here in Pakistan, through the support from the European Union, what we are trying to promote is inclusive and participatory development. And we are trying to encourage the cities to have the stock taking of their progress on SDGs and their progress on human rights. So we are trying to promote that culture of voluntary local review in Pakistan through this European Union funded Lead for SDG program. And we are looking forward and hoping that through such initiatives, the voices, because we believe in inclusive and participatory development and human rights goes hand by hand along together. So what we believe is that there should be the voices of the vulnerable groups. There should be voices of the lowest level governance structures, which include the village, towns, and cities. So their voices should be heard in monitoring and implementation of human rights laws and treaties. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I'll just see. Should just make sure that I'm not muted. Now, Mr. Imran, thank you for these very, I think, valuable and great examples and talking about these mechanisms, both the treaty implementation cell and the voluntary local reviews. And I mean, this rhymes with what Ms. Berlin, Cecilia, talked about earlier in the Swedish case, where there's this platform or toolkit or really, you know, help for decision makers and politicians to essentially promote a non-corruption culture and you know, promote human rights and so on. But I mean, if I mean, obviously, ultimately, and I will not proceed the conclude here. I mean, obviously, there is a question of human rights, but sorry, of political will. But maybe if I come back to you, Ms. Berlin, Cecilia, and this platform, if you compare what you've heard from the Pakistani example here that Mr. Imran spoke about, you know, can you maybe share some examples of how this platform has actually helped human rights protection and how this can be linked to the local initiatives against corruption and thereby also mitigating or preventing human rights violations? Would you like to respond to that?
Mm-hmm. Yes. First, I like to agree with Ali Imran that cities or municipalities or the local level is where the most of the citizens or inhabitants, the individuals meet the authorities. So therefore, that's really important to work from that level in the society. As the members organizations, we cannot tell our municipalities or authorities to work according to this platform, but we try to inspire them, and a lot of municipalities has actually adopted the platform. They can work with it or they can adopt it, and there are municipalities now that are expressing themselves as human rights municipalities. And as for the connection to the anti-corruption work, In the platform, we stress the human rights-based approach and the principles of non-discrimination and equality, participation and inclusion, and transparency and accountability. And there you can find strong connections. If you take, for example, the principle of non-discrimination and equality, as I said earlier, Sweden is a really small country with small municipalities, and there is always a risk of conflict of interest. It has also been a very homogeneous country, and a country where people are interconnected for generations. So if you respect the human rights approach principle of non-discrimination and equality, that could be a useful tool against bias, favoritism and nepotism, for example, which is especially important in Sweden. As I said, it's been historically a homogeneous country, now getting more and more diversified in recent years. So it's therefore really important to respect the non-discrimination and equality. If we take the principle of transparency and accountability in the platform as a human rights-based approach, you can say that transparency and accountability is key in the force against corruption. And there is a strong need for transparency in policy-making processes and decisions. And today, questions of open data and whistleblower systems are on top of the anti-corruption agenda. And here it's easy to see the connection to the human rights work that can be expressed more or articulated in that way. So and you can also, the principle of participation and inclusion, one often mentioned risk for corruption is when a sole politician or civil servant has a large mandate of his or her own. So when more citizens and organizations participate, as we have heard examples of during this session or this seminar, when there are more local participation in different processes and decisions, there are greater possibility to discover inappropriate behavior or avoid negative cultures being more or less institutionalized in the local authorities. So a strong and active civil society is both a watchdog and a voice concerning corruption, the work against corruption, as well as human rights.
Well, thank you, Ms. Berlin, for those comments. I must say, you know, if we weren't convinced before of the importance of the local and the city level in this work, I certainly am after having listened to all of you today. And I mean, this comment that, I mean, this is often where many people meet authorities at the most direct and close level, even though obviously government and state authority and the national are also important. But I think, I mean, obviously there's so many aspects of this. There's no silver bullet, but I mean, transparency is really an instrument or a notion which is so important for so many of the other efforts. But now, so thank you for that. And if I turn back to you, Mr. Imran, actually you were describing two different systems almost in Pakistan, with the treaty implementation cell and the voluntary local reviews. And I mean, what is the benefit of and how are these complementary, these systems, or is that a challenge in any way, or how do you see that?
Well, thank you very much. Excellency, as Ms. Berlin has mentioned, that cities are local settlements are the places where things are happening, and all data that comes from those local levels And if the local reporting is not strong, the data at the provincial or at the national level could have been a problem and challenge. I think voluntary local review are very important phenomena, and it is unfortunate that at the moment in Pakistan we are not having elected local government system in any of the provinces, and it's being handled by the executives. So if we see the data collection mechanism by treaty implementation cells, usually they do it through executive at the district level or at the local level, so they get these kind of information and reporting from those channels. But the systematic engagement with the local governments on human rights violation mechanisms or human rights reporting that has not been taken as a system. And that's where there is a need and importance of voluntary local review. We, at the moment, we are having voluntary national review, but we are not having mechanisms and support for voluntary local review. And that's where we are trying to work with the local authorities, the local council associations, the local governments, and encouraging them and providing them tools to do the voluntary local reporting. But I think voluntary national review is a national level report. Mainly they get the data from provinces and not from the local level. And this is a global challenge because UCLG has done a global research where we have observed around 65 countries, and we have seen whether the local governments were systematically engaged in that process or not. So half of them, they have not systematically engaged with the local governments. So I think there is a lot of appetite in merging these two things, the human rights violation through treaty implementation cells and VLRs. They can go side by side, and the data for treaty implementation cell can be fed in from those voluntary local reviews. I would also like to highlight the role of the watchdogs and civil society organizations and media, because most of the human rights violations, especially, they are reported through these channels, they are highlighted through those channels. And that's where the shadow reports from the civil society organizations comes in place. The reports, the data from UN agencies and other institutions comes in place. So I think these treaty implementation cells should not restrict themselves only up to the data collected through their district bureaucracy or executives. This data should come from multiple channels and multiple, including the role from the media, the civil society, the local governments. And if we talk about SDGs excellence, it's all about leaving no one behind. So it's all about inclusive and participatory development, and it's also hearing the voices of different sections of society. So I think that's very important that these implementation cells should get benefit from the local governments, they should get benefit from media, they should get benefit from the civil society organizations and their monitoring systems. Thank you.
That's very valuable. Thank you so much. And you actually preempted one of the questions that we got from the audience here. One of the questions, what could governments and non-governmental organizations do for the sake of spreading anti-corruption and of course, promoting human rights? I think we can tick that box, whoever put that question. Now, I have two questions. We do not have a lot of time, but I would like you to chew on two questions that have come in from our audience, and thank you all for contributing so well. And one is really basic, and I want to put this because it's important that we're not only preaching for the converted. So briefly, I would like Cecilia and Ali Ingram to just talk about this one. When we talk about human rights and corruptions, they are very broad issues. What is the scope of the concepts of human rights and corruption that you discussed today? I understand that many of you are fully, aware of this, but in order to not kind of, disappear into vague language, I think it's, so if you could just very briefly address that. And the other is quite a pertinent question as well to today's discussion, and that is do corruption and human rights violations happen more often in capitals than in the provincial cities? So if you can just briefly, and I would only give you like a minute each here because we need to wrap up slowly, but Cecilia Berlin, could you maybe get a go at these two questions first?
Your first question, when we work with anti-corruption, education and so forth for our members, we talk about it in a quite wide scope, because we talk about proper and improper behavior and legal and illegal, but still we carry the trust of the citizens and their taxpayers' money. So in order to to remain having, as we have in Sweden, a high trust in politicians and public officials, you have to have a broader scope than just talking about bribery and so forth. It's how it is perceived by the citizens. So that's one part. The other, I can say that there are, I think there are as much in that, if you use that definition, it is as much corruption in rural areas as in capital areas. In rural areas, you have the problem of conflict of interest. People know each other and exchange favors. In the larger cities, you have maybe more public procurement, large infrastructure initiatives, and that we know by research are high risk of corruption. So.
Well,
yeah.
Thank you for that. That was really useful. Nepotism versus procurement. I like that. Mr. Imran, briefly.
Well, Excellency, what I believe is corruption is a human rights violation. Where there is corruption, it's leading to slow the pace of development process. And if there is no development, that's going to violate so many of the human rights. So I see corruption as the root cause of human rights violation. Other thing, I'll just quote you an example that like human rights violation with regards to violence against women and children. It happens everywhere. It happens in all classes. It happens in the cities. It happens in the towns. It happens at the rural level. So it depends upon what kind of human rights violation we are talking about. To me, in Pakistan, the human rights violations are happening everywhere. It depends on what kind of human rights violation we are talking about. So generally speaking, human rights violations are happening at the capitals, at the provincial, and at the local level. So no place is free of human rights violation in Pakistan at the moment.
Well, it's kind of depressing to hear that, but at least the issues and challenges are similar in both places. So now, thank you so very much, Ms. Imran, Mr. Imran, and Ms. Cecilia Berlin for these quite interesting discussions, and really also thank you to our wonderful audience for putting us a little bit on the spot here, prompting us to drill into the key questions. Now, I would like to thank you, the two of you, and in order to start to wrap up, and we're really into the concluding final stretch of this interesting session today, I would like to return to our first speaker, Morten Kjaerum. You are not only a speaker, you are a prominent expert leading the Wallenburg Institute, and I'd like you to make some concluding remarks. So Morten, what have we learned today? And how do you think we can make sure that some of these relevant issues that came up, also best practices, are remembered and maybe also replicated? And are there maybe issues for further research that you think we should focus on? Or did we already cover the obvious today? Morten, please tell us, enlighten us.
Thank you very much, Jakob. I must say, I think it has been a fascinating couple of hours. I was just thinking, Jakob, why don't we just continue? Let's forget our schedule today and continue. I think this could actually unfold very much more. So no, it has been very stimulating, I must say. Very rich presentations from everybody, and a lot to take away. I mean, we heard from the cities from Korea, from Mexico, from Turkey. And what struck me here is, first and foremost, that there's so much to build on. I mean, it's really a momentum. If we go back just 2, 3, 4 years, I don't think we would have had the same richness of examples as we have heard today. So there is a momentum, and definitely let's capture it. As sort of an overarching element, I would say that a thing that has captured me is how do we work at the local level on these issues? And a sort of say a catch phrase could be a human rights-based budgeting. And here the example from Istanbul was, I will use it in all my future speeches, about sort of looking at the budget. How much do we spend on cars? For officials, 6 cars each, as far as I understood. Let's transform that into lowering the public transportation for students. I mean, that is sort of the essence of what human rights-based budgeting should be about and is about. So let's expand much wider on that. And I think there are a lot of, let's say, good examples. One thing is, are they brilliant examples making us wider, but also how do we do it? How do we go about it? And that's, of course, a number of the other issues that were alluded to or talked about, the transparency, the gender dimension of this, the decentralization, as we also heard from Mexico, which I think was very interesting, the smaller units, which of course make it more tangible and more transparent at the same time. And that is, of course, the buzzword then to the engagement of citizens and the right to participation. And here I have to refer again to the Office of the High Commissioner that did an excellent set of guidelines that were adopted by the Human Rights Council on participation. So how do we realize the right to participation? Extremely good. And maybe we should recommend to the High Commissioner that they do the next report on the link or linking it to corruption. How can that participation that they have unfolded so well, how can that then be linked to corruption? So we move on that and get that international framework for the work. Then, of course, the accountability has been on there, and the flip side, the impunity. I mean, we have to admit that there is an impunity, and it's that impunity that we need to challenge, and we do that via the accountability and building accountability mechanisms in at all levels, from the very local human rights bodies, city level human rights bodies, up to the national, and I would also say further up to the international donor community. I think there is some soul searching to be done in some of the major international donors. How much do they actually contribute or in a way facilitate to the corruption in different places? So a lot of questions that from the very local and all the way up need to be addressed. So I think with that, I have a lot to take away on, both in terms of further research. I mean, we're only in the beginning. We need to dig much deeper into a number of these questions. Training, education is there, and then at the very practical level, policy implementation. So thanks a lot. And I would also take the opportunity to thank you, Jakob, for excellent moderation of the day. I think that has really, you created a very dynamic panel here. Thanks a lot, and thanks for everybody on behalf of the Wallenburg Institute.
Well, I should thank you, Morten Kjaerum, for being our co-host. It has really been a pleasure both to plan and to implement this session today. And I think for no bad reason. I mean, it's an incredibly important area. I'm so glad we were able to highlight this link between cities and human rights and corruption. So thank you to you, really, and also thank you to all of the speakers and panelists who've contributed and made this possible for today. And so I am actually, my role is actually now to conclude this session, but we are certainly not stopping this discussion. I am quite convinced that it will continue, especially both with the city examples, the input from Kim So-ah and yourself, Morten Kjaerum, and also, of course, from the, how should we say, those who know and can talk about toolboxes that can be used in order to promote the agenda and the issues. So yeah, I really just like to thank you all, and this concludes the session. Congratulations to everybody, and also a particular thank you to the audience who's put us these really good questions. So, well, this concludes it. Let's close the meeting, but let's continue the discussion. Thank you. Goodbye.